Good afternoon. I'm Fred Leong, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Consortium for Multicultural Psychology Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2017 Annual Distinguished Lecture on Multicultural Psychology. We're very pleased to have Professor Stephen Heine from University of British Columbia give this year's lecture, but before I introduce Steve, I'd like to take care of a couple items. First, as usual, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll be having a reception with light refreshments and drinks at the end of the presentation from 5:30 to 6:30 upstairs in room 230. Everyone is invited, and I hope that many of you can stay for the reception, which is to honor our invited speaker and also the winner of the 2017 Joseph L. White Award. Next, I'm pleased to continue our tradition of presenting the Joseph L. White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award at the beginning of our annual distinguished lecture. To present this year's award, I'd like to introduce Professor Ignacio Acevedo from the CMPR Awards Committee.
Hello, everybody. It's really a unique pleasure to be representing our committee and giving this award. So before I start that, I would like to thank Lee June and Bill Chopik, who served on this committee. And I would like to say that this year was a very challenging decision for us. It was really exciting to see all of the very, very high quality multicultural work that is being done in our department. Many of the things that we reviewed were publication quality. We were very excited to see them, and so I think that speaks well for our department, our graduate students, and it also speaks particularly well about this year's award winner, Danielle King from IO. Danielle King is a fifth-year student in IO. She works under Anne-Marie Ryan and is interested in workplace diversity, resilience, and voice. The paper she presented covered intersectionality and a variety of processes associated with it. And it was really just a remarkable, very, very, very good paper. And we were delighted to have the opportunity to review it and award it. So we are going to have Danielle come up and give her this award in a round of applause. And $500 honorarium that you get to bother Dr. Leong about. So it was just a really remarkable paper, and we really appreciate it.
Can you stand together for a photo?
We can totally stand together for a photo.
Maybe if you just...
We can move. We can all. Can we move? We can move.
Yes.
We're being asked to move. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you so much. Very much.
So, congratulations again, Danielle. And my thanks to the awards committee. Now back to our main event. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Stephen J. Heine is the Professor of Social and Cultural Psychology and Distinguished University Scholar at the University of British Columbia, which is also where he received his PhD in 1996. He was previously an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's had visiting appointments at Kyoto University and Tokyo University. His research focuses on the ways that people maintain meaning in the face of threats, why people view genes as deterministic, and what aspects of our psychology are universal or culture-specific. He's published over 70 journal articles in such periodicals as Science, Nature, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and Psychological Review. He has authored the leading textbook in the field entitled Cultural Psychology, now in its third edition, and has recently written a trade book called DNA and Destiny. I think he has another one as well, as we were talking about. It's the same one. Okay. He's a fellow of the Society of Personality and Social Psychology, the Society for Experimental Social Psychology, the Association of Psychological Science, and the Royal Society of Canada. He received the Distinguished Scientist Early Career Award for Social Psychology from APA in 2003, and the Career Trajectory Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology in 2011. The title of his presentation is interesting, Weird Psychology, the Challenges of Searching for a Human Nature. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Stephen Heine.
right. Thank you very much, Fred, for that very kind introduction. And it's a great honor to be here, Fred was telling me the list of speakers that have participated in this. It's a really impressive bunch of great honor to be part of this and to see this very impressive multicultural consortium that you have going here. Today I want to talk about a challenge I think that we all face as psychologists. I think that a lot of the questions that we are trying to understand is trying to reveal something about human nature and what makes humans the way they are. And I think we face some particular challenges in doing so. And I specifically want to talk about some ideas from a paper that I wrote a few years back with my colleagues, Joe Hendrick and Ara Norenzayan, titled The Weirdest People in the World. One thing I've learned, if you title a paper The Weirdest People in the World, you end up with some interesting Google image searches. So this is me here, and this is the crowd. Glenn Beck, I know it's a weird honor to be in the same search as Glenn Beck. But in this paper, we explore, I think, two background observations that I don't think are controversial, or at least they're easy to defend. And that's that the psychological database represents a really narrow slice of humanity, and that psychological researchers frequently are trying to generalize from this sample. We're frequently assuming universality in our research. So I'll explore a bit of these here in detail. So first, the idea that psychological database is narrow. So Jeffrey Arnett, a few years back, did a review of the top journals in 6 disciplines of psychology. Well, who are the people that we are studying? Our knowledge base of psychology, who are these people? And he found out, well, that 68% of these subjects are American, and a full 96% come from the Western world. And moreover, 70% of the subjects are undergrads from these countries. So when we're talking about human nature, these are the people here that we're basing our understanding of human nature. And so we're generalizing from what is a pretty limited sample. And another way of stating this here is, just looking at how biased is a sample. Well, the odds of a randomly selected undergrad ending up in a psychology study is more than 4,000 times that of a randomly selected non-Westerner. Okay, so our field definitely has this real bias here in who we study. And I think it's interesting to explore, well, why might this be? One possibility is just that, well, U.S. universities lead the world. So maybe it's just that all the researchers are coming here to the U.S. and we're just studying the convenient samples around us. And this would be true of any field, potentially. I don't think this is so, and that the American dominance of psychology is not found to the same degree in other sciences. So there's a review that was done of 20 different science disciplines, found that 70% of psychology citations come from the U.S. So the vast majority of psychology citations coming from the U.S. It's the highest among 20 sciences compared. Contrast with, say, 37% of citations in chemistry come from the U.S. And there's a problem here because chemistry really is the same wherever you study it, right? The location doesn't have any impact on the results that you get. And I'm going to show some data here that with psychology, the results do matter. I mean, where you do your sample where you collect it does matter. And you can get, for some phenomena, some quite different results when you're doing them in different places. This was from a 1997 review. Another way of looking at this is just comparing past the U.S. Where do research findings come from? If you look at physics, the top 4 producers of physics citations are U.S., Germany, Japan, and France. It's from the same 97 review, and this is 1997 GDP rankings. You can see that big science costs big money, and you see that the best physics research, the most impactful work is coming out of the richest economy. And then if you look at what's the case for psychology, where the producers, it's the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. And as a Canadian, I'm surprised we're usually not on the top of a list anywhere. And we're a pretty small country, at least population-wise. So it's curious here to see where psychology research is coming from, whereas physics, you seem to need a big economy for it. For psychology, you seem to require good English language skills. That's where the bulk of psychology research is coming from. And another way you can see this is that psychology is the #1 major at many North American universities. It is at my university. I'm not sure where it stands here at Michigan State. I'm sure it's one of the bigger ones. And in many other parts of the world, psychology is not offered as a major at the university. So I think this is just a curious phenomena that I don't think has been well explained, why North Americans are as interested in psychology compared with the rest of the world. Something about here that we find really interesting, more so than the rest of the world. Okay, so that's one thing. Our database is narrow. I think another key observation here, though, that researchers tend to assume their findings are universal. This is often done in an implicit way, that we will talk about a human cognitive bias that we find, or we'll talk about this is something true of people. Rarely do we speak to the about our findings in terms of the samples that they're from. Often in our method sections, there's not much detail on the samples beyond maybe the gender of the participants, and we don't label our journals things like the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology of American Undergrads. We don't label our findings, our journals like that. We don't talk about our findings like that. There's some implicit assumption here that if we find something in one sample here, it's probably true of humans across the world. We will speculate on how this emerged in the savannas of Africa tens of thousands of years ago. We're quick to make these assumptions without actually looking to see, well, how similar are the findings elsewhere. And this isn't new to point out that psychology relied on a narrow database. So Kenneth Gergen and David Sears, or a couple others, have made this argument very forcefully. What we're arguing here, though, importantly, that the data is not just narrow, it's not representative, and it's often a distinct outlier in the distribution of findings. Because if you would want to generalize from a narrow sample, you would hopefully be within the center of a distribution, would be a safer place to generalize from. But as I'm going to show you, for many psychological effects, this sample that we're studying here, the standard database, tends to exist at the extreme end of a distribution here, tend to being an outlier for many key psychological effects. So we call the current database WEIRD here. WEIRD, an acronym standing for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich Democratic Societies. This is where the bulk of psychology participants come from. And as an aside, I've noticed that if you do label something with an acronym, a cute acronym, it does spread a lot better. That's something I've been surprised. People like saying this word, weird, and it seems to have traveled well. So I learned something about the marketing of psychology ideas by working on this paper. And what we're interested here is look at, well, how do the results of this one weird sample compare with those of other populations? So that's what we're trying to do in our review of the psychology literature. And I'm going to very briefly summarize this in a series of 4 telescoping contrasts. So I'm going to talk about findings that have been found in industrialized societies compared to findings found in non-industrialized societies. And then talk about findings done in Western societies compared to those from non-Western industrialized societies. And talk about studies with Americans, how do they compare studies of other Westerners, and talk then about university-educated Americans and how they contrast with other non-university-educated Americans. And we're focusing here on psychological processes that have been assumed to be universal. So I'm not talking about individual difference variables, like who is the most conscientious or the most extroverted. I'm not talking about individual difference variables, just phenomena that have been identified and are assumed to be universal. And also findings that were obtained from several different countries, so we can actually compare comparisons across a distribution of samples. And so what we tried to do here is to try to find all of the behavioral science phenomena that we could find that has been studied in several different countries. This article here was a real chore to do. It took us several years trying to amass all of the evidence that we could on these various behavioral psychological phenomena. So what I'm going to do here is just to present a brief snapshot of each of these contrasts here, and then I'm going to explore in more depth one particular case study of a psychological phenomenon, how it appears across cultures. So first, if you're looking at data that comes from industrialized societies versus non-industrialized societies, the industrialized societies occupy an extreme position for this set of variables here. Some visual illusions, and I'm going to give one concrete example here, go into more detail with that. Perceptions of fairness. So this is studied typically with economic games like the ultimatum game and the dictator game. The idea being that people trying to study how did motivations for fairness emerge. And what you find is in industrialized societies, people show higher motivation for fairness. And it actually seems to be predicted by exposure to market economies. The more exposure to a market economy, the more people will play fair in these economic games. How people engage in folk biological reasoning, how they make sense of the biological world around them. Research done with weird industrialized samples finds that people often project human qualities onto other animals, sort of anthropomorphizing other animals, and assuming if something's true of humans, that it exists in other animals. People in non-industrialized societies don't do this in the same way, that they project from one species to another species. And it probably reflects that in non-industrialized societies, people have a more intimate relationship. They're living dependent on various other species. And in an industrialized world, we learn a lot about animals from Disney Channel. So that have a very different relationship with animals. And egocentric spatial reasoning, so that the ways, so everyone here from an industrialized society, that you probably think about space is how it appears to you. So if you were going to recount some story about how a big wave crashed over you, you would encode it in terms of how it appeared to you. It crashed over on your right, and that's the way you would describe it wherever you are. And people in non-industrialized societies, they have more of an absolute spatial reasoning, and they tag space in terms of the cardinal directions. So they would see a wave coming over the west, so they would tell the story differently when they're facing another direction, so that always anchoring it to a cardinal direction. And something that we don't see in people from industrialized societies. So I want to talk about one visual illusion here, and this is one you're surely familiar with, the Muller-Lyer illusion. It's got a rather privileged position in psychological history. Jeremy Fodor explored it in terms of the idea that this is evidence of the modularity of the mind, that it's, and he's arguing for this because of this, the unshakability of this illusion here, that even though you've seen this illusion before, you know it's illusion, still the line on the left looks longer than the line on the right, and you just can't shake that, just showing how entrenched this illusion is in our visual system. Some things we've learned about this illusion is that it probably has emerged with our interactions with a world with carpentered corners, that we've learned that these edges here communicate information about perspective, and that in a situation like this edge is the furthest edge away from us in the scene, and this edge here is the closest edge to us in the scene. So this one we assume is further away, and thus it must be larger. And this is one important reason why we see this Muller-Lyer illusion. And this understanding of the Muller-Lyer illusion was facilitated by seeing what happens when you conduct this illusion in different cultures around the world. This is an old study from Marshall Segal, and he and his colleagues compared the Muller-Lyer illusion with various samples in Africa, small-scale societies in Africa, and then also South Africans of European descent on one extreme, and then even more so American undergraduates. And this here is the point of subjective equality, the percentage that the one line has to be longer than the other before they look to be equal. And for American undergrads, it's about a 20%. It's a very substantial illusion. That's why it's so unshakable. The sun in the Kalahari here, for them, there is no illusion here. They would call this the Muller-Lyer line drawing. They wouldn't see it as an illusion. So depending on which sample you're going to study here, you're going to get draw very different conclusions about the human visual system here, that you would see this Muller-Lyer illusion as a key part of our visual system here, and you draw a very different conclusion if you're looking at the Kalahari sun. Weird people aren't weird on everything, that there's many other psychological processes that don't, where industrialized societies are not existing on extreme positions. So there's other visual illusions, such as the horizontal vertical illusion, for instance, that you don't see the same pattern. Basic color perception is largely the same around the world, although it does seem that the color labels that you have influence the boundaries that you perceive of different colors. Recognition of basic emotional expressions is largely similar around the world, although there does seem to be these cultural display rules that are also learned. Psychological essentialism has been found very similarly in samples from a very diverse population around the world, and young children. There's also many findings from 2 sample studies that find evidence for cultural similarities, and some that find evidence for differences. that don't really speak to here which of these is an outlier, because there's only 2 samples. So many 2-sample studies do find similarities that we don't go into here. So that's a brief snapshot contrasting industrialized versus non-industrialized societies. Now I'd like to look at some contrast between Western societies from non-Western societies. And Western societies occupy a more extreme position for less antisocial punishment, and I will unpack that one in more detail in a minute. More analytic reasoning in Western societies, that is trying to understand the world in terms of breaking things down into their component parts and abstracting a set of rules that govern the operation of those parts, in contrast to more holistic reasoning, where you're perceiving the world as an integrated whole and making judgments based more on similarity and familial resemblance. More independent self-concepts, so thinking of the self as a self-contained entity that's distinct from others and is understood primarily in terms of its inner psychological characteristics, as opposed to a more interdependent self-concept in non-Western societies, which is more of self as anchored in a set of relationships and part of a social network with roles and obligations within those relationships. You see conformity everywhere around the world, but there's more conformity in the non-Western world than there is in the Western world on the same kinds of tasks, like the Solomon Asch line drawing task, for instance. More desire for choice. People from Western societies, they value having more choice. They want to make important decisions they want to make for themselves rather than have them made by others, more so in Western and non-Western societies. And morality that's almost exclusively based on justice concerns, as opposed also to concerns of interpersonal obligations or concerns about purity. Okay? In the non-Western world, those have more moral weight than they do in the Western world on average. So I want to talk about this less antisocial punishment, and this is something that has been studied, at least identified in studies of public goods games, trying to identify, well, what are the roots of human sociality? Why is it that people can cooperate with each other? And Ernst Fair and Simon Gachter conducted a famous set of studies back in 2000 with some Swiss students, and they set up this clever public goods game where people were given some real money, and they had the choice they could contribute some of their money to a pool. And the experiment would multiply any money in the pool by 1.6 and would divide that equally between the 4 players playing this game. So it's set up that the group would have its maximum payoff if everyone put all their money in. It's multiplied by 1.6 and returned back to people. But it's the clever design of this study is that for an individual, the best situation for them would be that if everyone else put in their money and they kept their own money, so wouldn't cooperate. So there's a real temptation here not to cooperate. And what Fair and Gachter added to this study, though, they added the opportunity, provided people the opportunity to punish someone, engage in what's called costly punishment. Because delivering punishment is always costly in the sense it puts the individual at risk for retaliation, when they have to spend resources monitoring and whatnot. And so they set up that if a person could take $1 of their own money away, and in doing so would punish another player, so the experiment would take $3 of that other person's money away, and people would pay $1 for the satisfaction of punishing this other person who they don't like the way that they're playing the game. And this addition of this punishment here played a very important role in their game, because what they were finding that when they didn't have the punishment, there was very little cooperation going on in the game. There's a lot of free riding. People just stopped contributing money to the pool, not wanting to be the sucker, because other people weren't cooperating either. But once they allowed this punishment rule added this punishment rule to the game, they got stable cooperation from it. And so they were concluding here that human cooperative motivations evolved in tandem with the motivation to want to punish those who weren't playing along with the rules. And they call this altruistic punishment. Now these are 2 norms that must have evolved together. And this was based largely on their data with Swiss students. It's been studied a lot with American students too. And then in 2007, Herman et al. Wanted to test the cross-cultural generalizability of this and looked in 14 different samples around the world. And I'm just going to show you some of their data here. And this is the altruistic punishment. This is not that people are paying to punish those who are free riding. And there's not that much cultural variability on this altruistic punishment side. It shows that people everywhere seem to within a very narrow band here, are quite willing to pay money to punish those who are free riding. What they weren't expecting to find was another kind of punishment that they had never identified before, which they call antisocial punishment. This is people who are paying money to punish someone else who is cooperating. Okay, and this seems like a curious thing. It's almost never found in the typical Western samples that are studied. It's a very rare phenomenon and never got any attention. But it's actually quite strong in some other societies in Oman, Greece, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. The effects of the anti-social punishment were strong enough that they completely canceled out the benefits of altruistic punishment. And at the end of the game, these players from these countries here end up with no money because they spent all their money punishing the other players, and they go home with no money. And it's a curious phenomenon. Well, why are people punishing others who are playing along? And it's seen that, one, they're punishing for revenge, that someone had punished them before, and so now they're going to return the favor and punish someone else. And also they would punish people who were winning the game, getting far ahead of them, and they would just pay money to take away their money and gain some satisfaction for this. And this has led to a lot of recent research trying to understand, well, how is it that you get these civic cooperation norms to emerge in the first place? And it's actually a very difficult thing to do. You should be happy that you live in a society where antisocial punishment is rare, because it actually does make civic cooperation a much easier goal to attain, and it's a real challenge to create this norm where it doesn't already exist. And again, if we were just studying this in typical samples the weird samples that we largely study here, this antisocial punishment wouldn't even be a phenomenon that we could study. The researchers had never even thought about it before, and it's a big problem in some other places in the world. Okay. Where Western societies do not occupy, this is just adding to this that there's many two-country studies that find differences, but we can't really tell with a two-country study where the Western pattern is unusual or is an outlier. And there are many phenomena here. Western societies do not occupy an extreme position. So sex differences in a variety of aspects of mate preferences, they look largely similar in Western and non-Western societies. The structure of personality appears quite robust in industrialized societies. With Western, non-Western, the big five factors tend to emerge in fairly similar ways around the world. And sex differences in violence, men being more likely to engage in violence in women, that upholds regardless of whether it's a Western or a non-Western society. The next contrast here then, Americans versus other Westerners, that Americans are at the extreme end of a distribution for a number of psychological processes. One, more defensive reactions to thoughts of death, and I'll unpack that a bit in a minute. Americans have even more desire for choice than other Westerners, who had more of a desire for choice than non-Westerners, so really an outlier among outliers here. Americans have even more independent self-concepts than do other Westerners, or more than non-Westerners, and engage in even more analytic reasoning. Okay, so getting data from America will give you an even more non-representative look on these traits compared with other Western nations. So exploring this more defensive reactions to thoughts of death, this comes from research on terror management theory. And terror management theory is, the idea is that humans are in this unique quandary that, like all organisms, we try to avoid dying. But unlike other organisms, best we can tell, we're the only species that is aware that we're ultimately going to fail at this task of avoid dying. And we all know this, and that terror management theory argues that this is going to lead to a great deal of existential anxiety, and so we want to get rid of this anxiety. And one way that we can get rid of this anxiety is by bolstering our cultural worldview. That is, by thinking of our culture as being true and good and strong, and by seeing ourselves as an exemplary member of the culture. This way we can sort of be imbued by the immortality of our culture, because unlike ourselves, our cultures will continue to exist after we have passed. And so the ways that you can see evidence for this cultural worldview bolstering is that people will become more patriotic. You remind them you're going to die someday. People become more patriotic. They're more eager to protect the status quo, enforce the rules of the society, and they come to dislike outgroup members more. People with other worldviews become more problematic when you're contemplating your death. And if there's been a meta-analysis done, terror management theory has been tested in dozens of different countries, hundreds of different studies here. And this is collapsing across the various kind of dependent measures. This is an effect size here. And you can see, first of all, this does seem to be a universal effect in terms of direction. So unlike the other examples I was discussing, this something we would call this a functional universal, meaning it seems that the phenomena is universal but varies in its magnitude. And Americans show a little more, stronger reaction to death thoughts than do other Westerners, than do non-Westerners. Why Americans are outliers is something that hasn't been confidently shown yet. Perhaps it's that there is greater existential anxiety in a more extremely individualistic society, that the U.S. is the most individualistic nation in the world, with the most independent views of self, and maybe this sense of, that to the extent that you're less tied to a social network with this heightened individualism might be what's behind this heightened existential anxiety. Hasn't been confidently shown yet. It's curious to speculate why you get this pattern. Right? So that's an example where Americans are outliers. The domains in which Americans do not occupy an extreme position, the only evidence we could find is from those previous contrasts between Western and non-Western and industrialized and non-industrialized. So that compared to other Western nations, it's those previous 4 domains that we see Americans being an outlier. So now I want to look at the last contrast here, which is college-educated Americans versus other Americans, and domains in which the college-educated Americans differ. One, which I'll unpack, is higher heritability estimates for IQ among college-educated Americans compared to other Americans. More desire for choice, which is high. So college-educated Americans have more desire for choice than other Americans, have more desire for choice than other Westerners, and more desire for choice than non-Westerners. Same with analytic reasoning and outlier among outliers. Same with more independent views of self, less conforming, more of a justice-based morality, and more defensive responses to death thoughts. So it's really, for many key psychological variables here, this sample is really an outlier at the tail end of a distribution. Let's talk a bit about heritability of IQ. So heritability estimates are typically studied by either comparing fraternal twins, identical twins, or looking at adopted families, seeing how similar people are to their adopted siblings versus their biological siblings. And so typical estimates of heritability of IQ is that the genome accounts for more than 50% of the variance, and shared and non-shared environments contribute negligibly to this. But one thing that's key to note is where these samples come from, and studies of adopted siblings are not representative of all families, in that on average families that adopt children are scored about the 70th percentile in terms of providing a stimulating educational environment. So not everyone gets to adopt. There's a competition among which families get to adopt, and generally they're in a position to provide a better educational environment. Also, twin studies, your social economic status doesn't determine the likelihood of you having twins, but it does determine the likelihood that you show up in a study. And that I noticed that you're recruiting twins for behavioral genetics work here, and that university students are far more likely to actually end up in a study than are twins who are living in rural neighborhoods or poorer neighborhoods. And so heritability of IQ might look quite different in other environments. This is data from Eric Turkheimer and colleagues' paper in 2003. If you look at the SES spectrum and you break it up into quintiles, look at what is your estimate of the heritability of IQ in these different quintiles, and that you find that the estimate of the contributions from the genome are higher among the wealthiest samples, which tend to be more likely to be college-educated, than on the poorer samples. And likewise, that the environment is estimated to contribute less, either shared or non-shared environment, in the wealthier samples than in the poorer samples. And the idea behind this is that there's just going to be less variability in terms of providing a stimulating educational environment among the wealthy samples than there is among the poor samples. That some poor families provide dismal opportunities to their children. Others provide really rich, engaging opportunities. And there's just more variability on this end. And this is something that's been replicated a few times with American samples. This is an interesting case because it's an example of a weird finding where the college-educated people provide a different result than the non-college-educated people. But it's also weird on another level in that studies done outside of the U.S. don't find the same gradation with IQ, heritability, and SES. I think it has to, best guess there has to do something with the degree of income inequality in a country. When there's more income inequality, you're more likely to get this effect. And so in Scandinavia, where there's less income inequality, you get a weaker effect of SES on heritability estimates. Domains in which college-educated Americans don't differ. This is a harder one to describe, but there's this one. I've never seen one of these before, a second-order meta-analysis. That means it's a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So representing over 7,000 studies, and looking at the second-order meta-analyses, they found similar findings for about half of the phenomena, similar findings between college-educated samples and non-college-educated samples for about half of the phenomena, but there was no clear pattern, really, that we could identify for which things tended to vary between college students and non-college student samples. So many phenomena which college-educated samples don't stick out, but there are several that they do as well. Okay, so that's a review of just a number of different phenomena that in which weird samples seem to be an outlier in terms of a distribution and how we might draw different conclusions depending on the sample that we have. I'm going to talk about now, this is a research program of mine, that something I started in graduate school. I'm interested in studying self-enhancement motivations in North American samples and East Asian samples. And show this as another way of just seeing how, depending on the sample you get, you can draw very different conclusions about the existence of a phenomenon. And self-enhancement is a very well-documented motivation in North American research. And there's been much less work on it in East Asia, and I'm going to talk about what we found with regards to that. So first, just what is self-enhancement? We operationalize it here as a motivation to focus on and elaborate more about one's strengths than about one's weaknesses, so that when you're looking at the world, you're doing so in a biased way, that anything that indicates something positive about yourself, you attend to and you remember and you elaborate. Anything that suggests that you're not doing so well, you might not dwell on so much or come up with an excuse for it or ignore it. I think it's that we all each have our own little Donald Trump inside our heads here, right? It's just sort of saying that this is the biggest crowd that ever appeared in Michigan State, period. And we want to attend to things that we want to believe and just forget about the other things. So here's some evidence for North American self-enhancement. One is that most North Americans possess high self-esteem. At least if you look at a distribution of self-esteem scores, our work in Canada finds that 93% of European descent Canadians score high on the measures of self-esteem. I spent a few years at Penn, and our average in self-esteem was considerably higher at Penn than it was from our Canadian samples too. High self-esteem is very prevalent in North America, and why this is relevant to self-enhancement is that the measures of self-esteem have you describing things about how well you can do things compared with other people. Do you think that you can do things well compared with other people? Do you have a positive evaluation of yourself? Other evidence for North American self-esteem is that most North Americans view themselves in unrealistically positive terms. So that we have, not just that we're seeing ourselves positively, but we're seeing ourselves in an unrealistically positively. So for example, one survey finds that 94% of American college professors think they're better than the average American college professor. And this has to be a bias, right? Average doesn't work that way, and it can't all be better than average. And this isn't just something about college professors. This is true across the board, that for many domains, especially important domains in life, people, North Americans talk about here, view themselves in unrealistically positive terms, think that they're better than average, better than most other people. And I think some of the strongest evidence for this motivation comes from studies that explore self-esteem maintenance strategies of what happens when we encounter negative feedback. We have these positive views about ourselves, and sometimes the world doesn't provide information consistent with that. How do we deal with this feedback? and that there's a variety of strategies that people rely on that helps to discount this negative feedback. So people might show a self-serving attributional bias where anything that goes well, it's because of them, and anything that goes poorly, it's because of the situation. Or that people might engage in cognitive dissonance and to rationalize their situation so that they end up looking quite good. Or people might engage in self-handicapping, where they will actually sabotage their own performance just to provide themselves with an excuse to explain away their bad performance, because they weren't really trying anyways. And so anyways, across a very vast literature, there's lots of evidence here that these various ways that we can see a self-enhancement motivation in North Americans. And so a question I want to consider here is, well, is this a basic human need or is it culturally learned? And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it is a culturally learned bias, or at least the degree to which we show it seems to be culturally learned. Because when we have cultural products like this, Be a Winner self-esteem coloring book, where honor roll, number one cat, even the cat is number one. So we encouraged to think positively of ourselves growing up. And I think some really strong evidence that this motivation here is culturally learned, that it's been increasing over time. So this is data from Jean Twenge's work, looking at measuring with the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, the exact same scale. She's looked at how it's, if you look at the published literature in the year that the papers were published and what the average self-esteem was. In this case, she used a 4-point scale, so 25 is the midpoint of the scale, and you can see that self-esteem over time has been rising. She stopped studying self-esteem, started studying narcissism, which has continued to rise over time. The millennial generation is the most narcissistic generation on record. It's probably going to continue in the future, so that these positive self-views seem to be increasing over time. So this is one source of evidence that there's something culturally learned about this tendency. And I've done a lot of research in Japan on self-enhancement. Right after I got my undergrad, I moved to Japan for a couple of years where I taught English in a small town called Obama, of all things, and got exposed to, what I was struck by moving to Obama was that all that I learned in my social psychology classes growing up in Canada didn't seem to apply well to my new community. And in particular, I was struck by how I didn't see the same evidence here for at least the view that thinking positive thoughts about yourself is really important. I didn't see that to the same degree in my Japanese colleagues. And I've done many different cross-cultural studies on self-enhancement. This is just one study here. I'll describe a few others. This one, we went to university clubs in Japan and in the US. And from each club, we got 5 people. And we asked those 5 people who all knew each other well to complete a scale where they evaluated themselves, and then also to evaluate their 4 clubmates. Okay? So then we were able to compare how positively people evaluated themselves with how positively their 4 clubmates evaluated them. And we're operationalizing here. If people evaluated themselves more positively than their peers evaluated them, we call that evidence for self-enhancement. If we found that people were evaluating themselves more negatively than they were evaluated by others, we would call it evidence for self-criticism. And so this is the US data here. This is a distribution of all the results here. This is the point of zero bias. This line here would be where people's self-evaluations are equal to the evaluations by their peers. And you can see that most Americans, or 64%, are rating themselves more positively than how others viewed them, and 36% viewed themselves less positively. So this is overall evidence of self-enhancement, not particularly strong evidence for self-enhancement, and I think that's one important point to note, that the magnitude of self-enhancement varies a lot by the kind of task. And one reason why this task produces less self-enhancement is that people have very positive views of their friends too. So it's not like you're comparing yourself to some random person, but to your friends who you view quite positively. That's what the American data looked like. And when you look at the Japanese data alongside it, you see that, 16% of our Japanese respondents viewed themselves more positively than they were evaluated by their peers. And the majority, 84% here, were viewing themselves in self-critical terms. Quite a pronounced cultural difference here, that the self-enhancing views of the self in the US were more common than they were in Japan. And this is just one instance. There's I wanted to talk about another way of seeing evidence for how these self-enhancing motivations are tied to culture, tied to exposure to North American culture. I've measured self-esteem in several thousands of people now using the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, and we've broken up this sample into these groups here, which sort of show a continuum of exposure to North American culture. So we have a big group of Japanese who have never been outside of Japan. Their self-esteem on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale here is just over 30. We use a 5-point scale, so 30 is the midpoint, so just slightly over the midpoint. Then Japanese who spent some time in the West, they're a little bit higher. Recent Asian immigrants, East Asian immigrants to Canada, this not just Japanese, but also Chinese and Koreans. The bulk of the group is Chinese, a little bit higher. Long-term Asian immigrants to Canada, meaning they've been in Canada more than 7 years, a little bit higher. Second-generation Asian Canadians, slightly higher. Third-generation Asian Canadians, higher. And then European Canadians, about the same as the third-generation Asian Canadians. So that we can see as exposure to North American culture increases, so self-esteem increases. And to the point that third-generation Asian Canadians look the same as European Canadians. And so if we could generalize from this, we might say that it takes 3 generations to fully acculturate psychologically, at least in terms of attitudes towards the self. We've also found similar findings with longitudinal studies. We look at Japanese moving to Canada, their self-esteem goes up after they move to Canada. We look at Canadians moving to Japan, their self-esteem drops after they move to Japan. And so it does seem that how you view yourself is tied to the cultural environment that you're being exposed to. But there's been a lot of research on this now, enough that it's a big enough literature to do a substantial meta-analysis on this. And so we looked at all the studies that had a Western sample and an East Asian sample, comparing them on some measure of self-enhancement. And a positive D shows evidence for self-enhancement, and a negative D shows evidence for self-criticism. And if you look across the various different methods that have been used, for the Western samples, you get quite a bit of variability here, but the vast majority of studies here are showing a positive effect. The average effect is a D of 0.86, which is a large effect. Evidence for self-enhancement is strong. You might notice that there's not a funnel shape here, which is you typically get in meta-analyses, and the reason there's not a funnel shape here is that because this is about 12 different methods that are explored here. So these are, we're looking at there's an average effect, self-serving attributional bias, unrealistic optimism, and many other things. If you actually look at the cultural difference between Westerners and East Asians, you get that nice funnel, and it doesn't show evidence of a publication bias either. That's the Western sample. We look at the East Asian sample, you get a different effect. Some studies find clear evidence of self-enhancement, but some find clear evidence of self-criticism. On average, the effect here is about 0, that the evidence for self-enhancement in these same studies here is largely not there for East Asians. And each of these dots corresponds to one of the dots in the previous study. So all of these studies had an East Asian sample and a Western sample using the identical methodology. And so to summarize that meta-analysis then, there are large cultural differences in self-enhancement motivations. Westerners show consistent strong evidence for self-enhancement, East Asians don't, and many studies East Asians show evidence for self-criticism. I want to think, well, can there be some alternative accounts that might account for this cultural difference? And so I'll just talk about the few that we encounter the most. One is that maybe it's the case that East Asians, being more of a group-oriented culture, might show more self-enhancement for their groups, so that the group is enhanced and not the individual self. So the reason you see this cultural difference is because we've been focusing on an individualistic sense of self, which East Asians don't share as much, so we're not going to see as much evidence for self-enhancement. And so consistent with this alternative explanation, you do see that East Asians will show more evidence for group enhancement than they do for self-enhancement. At odds with this, though, is that North Americans enhance their groups far more than East Asians do for the same group. So it's not the case that East Asians are self-enhancing by enhancing their groups, and that's what's accounting for the difference in motivation. Still, North Americans are doing so more than East Asians. They do so more for evaluations of their families, for their romantic partners, for their schools. Patriotism scores, the U.S. is usually the highest in the world on patriotism. Patriotism scores are much lower in East Asia. So it seems that across the groups that have been studied, North Americans do this do this more. And I think this is because self-enhancement of the group is still just an extension of the self. That one of the reasons why you probably think a lot of Michigan State is it reflects upon you here in this way. It's part of you. And these self-enhancement motivations generalize far beyond the self. And here's maybe one, quickly describe one study we did, I think, that shows this, this spreading stain of the self, how far the self generalizes, by looking at the endowment effect. And what the endowment effect is, that it's the reason why Craigslist is always problematic, because the sellers think their junk is worth more than buyers do. And that's because owners just think that, if I was going to want to sell my laser pointer, that I would think this is a great laser pointer, it's mine, and you probably wouldn't have such a positive assessment of it. And there's been a few reasons offered for the endowment effect. One of the reasons, though, is a self-enhancing argument, that owners identify with their possessions so that my positive self-view bleeds onto my stuff, too. And we see that North Americans show a more pronounced endowment effect than East Asians. And here's a study that we actually did with Carl Falk, who's in your education department here, my former grad student. And we did this study we showed everyone a mug. They looked at a Starbucks mug. We did this in Japan, and we did this in Canada. And we had a manipulation there. We had half of the people, please write about how this mug has personal meaning to you. So how can this reflect upon yourself? And the other half, we asked them to write about how this mug has no personal meaning to you, how it has no attachment to yourself. And then we randomly assigned, one person is given the mug to keep. They are the seller, and the poor buyer doesn't get the mug. And we asked people, the sellers, well, what is a minimum price that you would sell your mug for? And buyers are asked, what is the maximum price that you pay for it? And if buyer's maximum price is higher than the seller's minimum price, then there's a transaction and the mug is sold. But we're interested in these prices that people are offering here. And if you look at the no object association, where people are told to reflect on how this mug is not associated with yourself, we find a very nominal trend towards an endowment effect in both cultures. Neither of these is a significant effect. It's a null effect of an endowment effect for both European, Canadians, and Japanese. In the heightened object association, where people are reflecting on how the mug is a part of themselves, then the European Canadians show a pronounced endowment effect, and Japanese don't show an endowment effect. They show a non-significant reversal here. So that the spreading stain of self-enhancement covers all things that reflect upon the self. Second alternative explanation, maybe East Asians will self-enhance in domains that are important to them, and the reason why we haven't been finding these evidence for self-enhancement in East Asians is we've been asking the wrong questions. Maybe if we ask questions, things that are really important to them, they would show it. And so consistent with this, East Asians self-enhance more for traits that are more important in the better than average effect paradigm. Something that Konstantin Sedekides has a few papers on, arguing that self-enhancement is more universal. It's pan-cultural because you do see this positive correlation between trait importance and self-enhancement in East Asians. At odds with this is East Asian self-enhancement is not stronger for more important traits in 11 other different paradigms that have been used. So there's been a lot of different things that this has been studied with. And if you look overall, a meta-analysis across all these studies, there is a positive correlation for North Americans between the importance of a trait and the amount they self-enhance, a weak positive correlation, and the correlation doesn't exist for East Asians. So I don't think there's good support for this alternative explanation. And what I think is the most challenging alternative explanation here is perhaps East Asians have private self-enhancing feelings, but they're on a self-report questionnaire, they're not sharing those feelings. Because that these studies might just happen to what people say and not what people feel. And so that maybe there's modesty norms that are more pronounced in East Asia which color this. And I definitely would agree that there are stronger modesty norms for self-presentation in East Asia than in North America. One of the first things I learned in Japanese class was how to deny a compliment. That was a very important lesson we had in the first class. And it was, the instructor said, if someone says to you that it's a wonderful meal you cook, you're an excellent cook, the right answer, the correct answer is no, not at all. I'm not an excellent cook. I need to work more at my cooking. Okay, and the teacher is emphasizing, you have to say this. It doesn't matter if you think you're the best cook in the world. This is the right thing to say. Okay? And so maybe that's what we're capturing in these studies. Maybe our studies just aren't getting at what people feel. Conversely, you could say that maybe North Americans have norms for bravado. Maybe people think they're supposed to present themselves more positively than they really feel. Maybe I'm not so confident, but I'm going to say I'm the best. And so maybe these self-presentation norms conceal this. How much time do I have till?
You have another 5-10 minutes if you need it.
Okay. This study takes a while to explain, so I'm going to I would say the evidence suggests it's not a matter of self-presentation things if you truly believe. I can talk more about this study in question period if you like. Why are East Asians self-critical? I think you see these cultural differences because in contrast to a currency that matters in North America and in an individualist culture, I think a valued currency here is self-esteem. Having a positive assessment of yourself helps provide you with the motivation to succeed as an individual, to have the confidence to feel you can accomplish things as an individual. I think a key currency in East Asia is more to maintain face. And face, the term face, the expression to lose face, is translated into English from Chinese from the mid-19th century. It was originally a Chinese expression. And how face is described is face is the amount of social value that others give you, this is key, that others give you, if you live up to the standards associated with your position. So I can potentially claim the amount of face that comes with a visiting professor from the University of British Columbia to the extent that you think that I'm living up to the standards you have with that position. And to the extent that you don't, I lose face. And to the extent that you do give me this, that you view me as meeting that standard, then I would maintain face. And the challenge with face is that it's more easily lost than it is gained. Okay? Because all these self-deceptive maneuvers that we have where I can convince myself that I'm really great, they don't work on you, right? They work for me. I can't convince you to think that I'm great in that same way here. So I always run the risk of saying something stupid and losing face in your eyes, of not meeting your standards. And there's a variety of people here with different standards, so you never really know how you're going to fare with someone. So it's very easy to lose face. It's very hard to gain face, because to gain face, the amount of face is tied to your position. So I need a promotion to gain face. Maybe I get hired at Harvard or become dean, I would have a bigger claim on face. But until then, I don't. So face is always hard to gain, because you actually have to move up the position. So the way to maintain face is it's important to attend to potential shortcomings, where I might be potentially screwing up and not living up to your standards here. And so by attending to these shortcomings here, this allows for self-improvement by directing attention to those areas where there's the most room for improvement. And here I'm going to describe one study that just shows how cultures do differ in these attitudes towards self-improving. The study we did with Canadian university students and with Kyoto University students in Japan. And we had people receive either success or failure feedback on a creativity test. So we gave people this creativity test and it was rigged. One version was all easy questions, the other version was all hard questions, and they then saw how their score compared to a distribution of other people. And so on average, people in the success condition found out they were on the 85th percentile, and the people in the failure condition found out they were on average of the 20th percentile. Okay? And they did this all privately, too. We're trying to rule out self-presentation norms here, so people were doing this in a room by themselves, graded their own with an answer sheet, compared their scores with others. And then they're left alone in the room with another version of the creativity test. And we actually had an elaborate ruse where the computer program wasn't working, so the experimenter had to leave. And while they were away, if they wanted, they could work on the second set of creativity items. And what we were interested, though, is to how long are people going to persist on this second creativity test after they've just learned that they're either really good at this or that they're really bad at this. And we had a hidden camera that was videotaping them at the end of the study. We told people, we've just been videotaping you, we have your permission to look at the videotape, and then everyone gives us this permission, and then we measure to see how long do they persist on the second test. And we found a dramatic difference, a dramatic cultural difference, replicated in many studies and many labs now, where that Canadian pattern is something replicating a pattern seen in the self-efficacy literature in the West quite a bit, that Canadians persisted longer on this task of creativity when they thought they were really good at it than when they thought they were bad at it. Okay, that they persisted a few minutes longer here at this task, or 2 minutes longer. And in contrast, Japanese showed the exact opposite pattern. Japanese persisted longer at this task when they found out they were bad at it than when they found out they were good at it. And our later studies showed that this has a lot to do with the Japanese view performance on this task to be more incremental, more of a function of their efforts than Canadians did. Some other questions that aren't shown in this graph, we also asked people, well, how important do you think creativity is to succeed in life? And Canadians go, oh yeah, creativity is very important, very important. And who really needs creativity anyways? And the Japanese thought creativity was more important when they had failed on it than when they succeeded. We also asked people, how accurate do you think this test measures creativity? And they said, well, that's a very accurate test. And this was a garbage test, and the opposite pattern for Japanese. So we saw this evidence across the spectrum here that the failure feedback was more motivating for Japanese and the success for Canadians. So Japanese showed this self-improving orientation more. Okay, so some conclusions about self-enhancement then. The nature of the sample matters greatly. You're going to draw opposite conclusions if you studied a Japanese sample than a North American sample. I would think in terms of, well, which is weirder, which is the more unusual pattern here, and I think in this case, both of these represent poles. We haven't found a sample that's more self-critical than Japanese. From my knowledge, it's the most self-critical sample in the world. Koreans are very close, and more self-critical than Chinese samples, although they're still quite self-critical. And North Americans seem to be the most self-enhancing sample too. So I think we're looking at two extreme ends of the distribution, and you would reach very opposite conclusions depending on which sample you draw. So just going back to summarize all the weird people findings, more generally then, across the board here we find many instances of universality in psychological phenomena, but there's a lot of evidence for cultural variation, pronounced cultural variation. Also, what I think is important here is that many of the phenomena that varied across cultures in our review, I think you could call fundamental. Right? That's we're looking at sort of Muller-Lyer illusions, these motivations for fairness in economic games, self-enhancement motivations, your reactions to thoughts about death, how you explain the biological world. I don't think there's good evidence to suggest a priori which phenomena we could assume to be universal. I think we have a bad track record of this because I think we've generally been assuming our findings are universal when often they aren't. And I don't think in the absence of data we can have much confidence of how much something will look similar across cultures without actually getting that data. And in many key domains, the data from the weird samples are outliers, and in these outlier situations, the weird samples would be the worst sample you could choose to generalize to the species because you're looking at the tail end of a distribution. Some common concerns that we hear that perhaps we've cherry-picked those rare exceptions when weird samples appear unusual, and we were very worried that people are going to come to us and say, aha, here's something where the opposite pattern is true, because it was a very hard review to do. There weren't any search terms we could plug into PsycInfo to yield these findings. We had to sort of just review the database the best that we could. And our paper is published at BBS, and you get 20 reviews, so we were thinking, oh no, someone's going to have some counterexamples. Some people did have some examples, but they all fit the weird people pattern. That we have yet to see an example that someone's presented will show the opposite pattern. Maybe there's methodological problems that make it appear that people in other cultures differ from weird samples when in fact they don't. And this is something that is always a challenge with cross-cultural research, and it's sort of the standard that you're being held by how well you can create a similar, that your measures are perceived similarly across cultures. I think it's definitely possible that some of these findings here do relate to methodological issues, but I think it strains credulity to think that's true for all of them. And non-psychologists tell us this is obvious. I think if you talk to people outside of a psychology department, they'll say, of course that's true. We could have told you. You didn't have to do all this research. That, of course, people differ around the world, and the American college student is an unusual creature. Why are weird samples so weird? I think one way that industrialized life really is a huge departure from lifestyle of ancestral humans. It would be surprising, I think, if there weren't differences found. Why is America so unusual? Maybe it's something with the frontier culture mentality. Maybe it's something with the extreme version of Calvinism that the first Puritans brought here that became sort of the norm that other subsequent ways immigrants had to adopt to. These are largely speculations. Also, weird people tend to speak English, and maybe there's something about these ideas are anchored in English constructs. And also maybe there's researchers, the findings appear weird because we're studying things that are especially obvious in American samples. That's why we study them. That we don't tend to study face so much in India. So we don't tend to study ideas of a caste system. We don't tend to study concerns about honor, and perhaps because they're not as pronounced here. Maybe if we did study like how much people are concerned about face around the world, maybe then we find that well, maybe China is the outlier and is the weird sample on that concern. So perhaps this is that we've chosen topics based on where weird samples are outliers. I think some implications. Weird samples limits the topic of research because we tend to study things that are familiar and pronounced within these samples. I think studying weird samples has the unintended consequence of marginalizing international researchers because the bulk of citations come from the US, and so it's just the bulk of the ideas are coming from the US, so cognitive dissonance has been discovered by Leon Festinger, and then the rest of the world tries to replicate it and isn't doing a good job at replicating it, and then might assume, well, we're doing something wrong. Americans keep finding this cognitive dissonance thing, why can't we find it? And I think this has an unintended consequence of marginalizing the rest of the world where the replications won't hold for a phenomenon that's more pronounced in a weird context. And importantly, that international interventions, if they're based on weird research, they might not generalize, they might not work so well in other contexts. And Ethan Waters has a great book on this called Crazy Like Us, and how much of psychiatric ideas are discovered in the US and exported around the world and often don't fare so well around the world. I think the weird people problem runs afoul of the replicability crisis because the replicability crisis is about trying to increase our confidence in internal validity. And I think when you're trying to maximize on one dimension, you're often going to compromise the other one. I think the dimension that gets compromised when you're maximizing internal validity is external validity. And because the consensual solutions that have emerged from this replicability crisis are we need bigger samples and more replications. And that's incentivizing more convenient samples, MTER, big student samples around you, and making it even less likely you're going to tend to harder to run samples. And so we recommend an affirmative action for studies around difficult to obtain samples because they have more added value. We think they actually have more information than a sample from a more familiar, convenient sample. Also, the nature samples confounds evaluations of replication. So what do you do when you say, oh, we tried to replicate your phenomena in this other context here and it doesn't replicate? Does that show that the finding isn't reliable, or is that showing that there is a boundary condition with this other sample? And I think really people before replication attempts should discuss the similarity of the sample and the proposed topic, and before they've actually launched the replication attempt, and how much they think the difference of the sample from the original sample should matter in terms of impacting the replication. And researchers we tend not to provide a lot of detail about the nature of our samples. I don't think we have a good excuse for that. Where to go from here? I think most researchers, whatever your pet phenomenon is that you study, you would find it informative to get some cross-cultural research. If I said, I have run your study in Burkina Faso, I have some data about your pet phenomena, I think most researchers would say that would be informative. I'd be curious to find out what it's all about. And we're just not incentivized to get that hard-to-get data. And so just last 2 minutes here to say some things that some solutions we can do. I think the easiest solution is that we should just be explicit in our paper about the kinds of generalizations that we're making beyond our samples. Who are we generalizing to? That we have found this here with American undergrads. Do we think this would generalize beyond there? We should be explicit about, well, what kind of evidence do we have to help support our generalizations? That research on a related phenomena found similarity across contexts, so maybe ours would too. Or other research found a boundary condition here with this related phenomena, so maybe we might expect that boundary condition. We should just be explicit about it rather than just not talking about it. I think we just need more information about samples. We have supplementary online materials now. This is going to foster more useful meta-analyses to help see the role of sample characteristics. And we really just need to get better norms for sharing data, which we traditionally haven't had. And last, I think for a lot of important psychological phenomena, we really should be studying these in big multicultural, interdisciplinary collaborations, forming international networks of long-term ongoing research collaborations across the diverse population. I think that's the ultimate way to get the best data on these topics. And so just thanks to my two co-authors here on the Weird People paper, Joe Henrik and Ara Norenzayan. Thank you very much. Any questions on it?
Yep, about 15 minutes. comparison that you use, like the group, whether it's a country or a cultural comparison, did you look at kind of even the variance within like those countries or the cultures on some of the things that you talked about?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point, because there's, of course, culture is not, it doesn't share the same boundaries with country. In our study here, though, we did make that we only looked at data from across samples, just because it becomes challenging. First of all, most studies aren't marked with where in the country they came from. The sample information isn't there. So that if you ran your study here in Michigan, and someone else is running the study in Louisiana, it actually isn't specified in the materials of most studies. So we didn't look at that. I imagine you would still see some very important variability on some phenomena. You do find that so the culture of honor, for instance, there's more evidence that in the U.S. South than the U.S. North. And I think there's many other phenomena that we might expect there to be some variability within countries too. But we didn't include that in our review just because we didn't have a good way of identifying where these samples within a country came from.
What about gender effects within the context of your research?
Yeah, so we didn't explore gender effects across cultures here. That's not, I don't think there was, we look at sex differences in violence and sex differences in mating preferences. We did look, that was one thing where there's a literature comparing those values across countries, and they actually look quite similar. Other than that, we didn't have I think those are the only phenomena that we reviewed related to gender across cultures. Yes?
So cultures probably aren't static over time. They are probably changing a bunch.
Sure.
Do you know if there's any research comparing, like, so you said the magnitude and often presence of effects varies across different samples and cultures?
Yeah.
Do you have any sense if there's some evidence showing maybe those things are changing as well? Maybe some effects are emerging in some non-Western or non-European countries? That's something that's interesting.
That's interesting. So the one thing I noted here with the self-enhancement literature, there is work by Jean Twenge and colleagues who looked at changes across time on that. So that's something that does seem to change across time, and it changes across place. So maybe the things that are changing across place here might also be the ones most likely to see changes across time. And that's a really interesting idea. It does, because they vary across place, it does suggest that it's sensitive to the cultural context. So I think it makes sense to expect changes across time. So maybe that would be a good, useful heuristic if you wanted to look at cross-temporal changes in psychological phenomena, to identify those that differ widely across contexts, and they should be more sensitive to changes across time, I think.
Are you seeing any movement toward researchers beginning to do what you're saying about the sample? For instance, people of color, we publish in Journal of Black Psychology, so we make it clear.
Right.
Clearer. Many of the multicultural researchers, some of them, are clearer about their biases.
Yeah.
But are you beginning to see a shift in mainstream researchers to admit their biases? And could you talk more about
Yes. So
the psychology behind the reluctance to admit it?
Right. So I guess I have two reactions. On the one hand, I mean, I'm happy that this paper is the one that I've worked on that's got the most attention. That it has. People seem to know about this more than anything else I've worked on. It's cited a lot. It's cited a lot outside of psychology. And within psychology, actually, John Haidt last year at SPSP in 2016 was introducing Joe Henrich, and he said, he's one of the co-authors on this Weird People paper. It's the one that we've all read and none of us have done anything about it. That was the way he introduced it, which I thought was funny. But I do think there's, sometimes it feels like that to me. But on the other hand, there are, I think, some very promising signs. So if you look at the editors of JPSP for both attitude, social cognition, and the interpersonal processes, both in their letters specified that this is a value that they are looking, that they hold strongly, and that they want, this is one of the criteria that they are looking for. They're saying trying to get more diverse samples. So people are saying that. NSF has this initiative right now of trying to explore ways of getting people to have more diverse samples, and so there are discussions underway. I don't think there's any end result to this yet, exactly how to incentivize this more. So I think people are becoming more and more aware of this topic now. I mean, there is a substantial body of evidence now that cultures do vary on lots of things, and I think people are becoming aware of it. To me, it feels like it's going slower than I would have liked, but we do definitely see signs of progress. Well, I do worry that the replication crisis is pushing us in the opposite direction, because now the concerns are internal validity, and I think that is just in people to, how can I get a really robust estimate of my effect size, which means I need 5 times the sample size that I had previously, and so I'm not going to Burkina Faso to get that. Use MTurk.
If there are no other questions, I have a gift for Steve. It's a small token of appreciation. Please join me in thanking him again for... We invite you to join us upstairs in room 230 for the reception if you can make it. Thanks again for coming.